Welcome to Hungry Theologian, helping you taste and see that the Lord is good. Food is found all over the Bible, and I believe it's one of the many elements of creation through which we can encounter God and worship Him more deeply. Alexander Schmemann describes the creation that we eat as divine love made food. I want to help you learn to cook so you can enjoy God's good gift of food. We're beginning with a series of lamb recipes from the book Supper of the Lamb by Robert Farrar Capon. I highly recommend this book as an introduction to thinking in a Christian way about food. Capon writes as someone who clearly loves God and loves food, which leads him to spontaneously break into praise as he describes a dish. One of the early chapters tells you to spend an hour sitting with an onion, slowly taking it apart and examining every piece of it. In our fast-paced culture, we rarely take that much time to simply attend to creation. Capon wants to instill in his readers a deep respect for the things God has made, rather than mindlessly consuming on our way to the next thing. What if we paused to consider that every texture and flavor that we eat was first imagined in the mind of God? The book is organized around one central recipe, lamb for 8 persons 4 times. This recipe takes a single leg of lamb and creates 4 different dishes. As we continue in this series, we'll talk more about the significance of the lamb in Scripture, particularly as it relates to the Easter season. But for now, let's start cooking. Capon's recipe calls for a whole leg of lamb, but you might have trouble finding one at your local grocery store. And if you do, they can be pretty expensive. Instead, what you're more likely to find when you buy a leg of lamb is something that looks like this. This is a leg with the shank, or lower part of the leg, cut off. It's going to be cheaper, easier to work with, and easier to find in the grocery store than a whole leg. Make sure you buy one that still has the large bone running through it. I've seen grocery stores label this as a boneless leg of lamb, when what they really mean is they cut off the shank bone. So look at the cut you're buying to see if it has the bone. Don't just rely on the labels. Because we're going to use this leg of lamb to cook several different dishes, you'll want to get the biggest one you can find at your grocery store or butcher. If you're using a leg of lamb like this without the shank, it might be harder to get 8 servings of 4 different dishes out of this single leg. But if you're cooking for fewer than 8 people, you'll be fine. We first need to remove about 1/3 of the lamb for our stew. Precision isn't necessary here. Just estimate what 1/3 of your leg of lamb would be, starting from this end, which is the hip joint. Make a cut at that point all the way down to the bone. Then turn your lamb 90 degrees at a time to continue that cut all the way around the bone. Look at where the bone is in your piece of meat. We're now going to cut along the bone to start taking the stew portion off the bone. If you're not very confident, just make small, gradual cuts. Once you've reached the bone, start to cut this portion of the meat off the bone. Keep your knife against the bone as much as possible so that you don't lose as much meat on the bone. Don't stress too much about getting it off the bone perfectly though. Any meat scraps left on the bone will add flavor to our soup in part 4, so nothing will go to waste. Just keep following the bone with your knife, and eventually you'll have your stew portion removed from the bone. Stick the remainder of your leg of lamb in the fridge while we work on the stew. Cut your stew meat into bite-sized pieces, then set aside while you prep your vegetables. Peel and slice 3 medium onions, then crush 6 cloves of garlic. If you don't like using fresh garlic because it seems like too much work to peel, I'd recommend buying whole peeled garlic at your local grocery store. You lose a little bit of flavor compared to peeling fresh garlic, but not nearly as much flavor as you lose when you buy the jar of pre-minced garlic. Peel and slice a large carrot or several smaller ones. Next, we'll prepare our mushrooms. I'm using about 1 pound of mushrooms because I really like them, but feel free to use less according to your taste. As Capon recommends, I'm going to cut off the stems and save those for a stock, but you could certainly use the mushrooms whole if you wanted. Then I'm just going to quarter the mushroom tops. Finally, chop about 1/4 cup of parsley. Now we're going to brown the meat in a cast iron or stainless steel pan over high heat. Just make sure you keep the meat in the pan. Turn your heat down if the smaller pieces are browning too quickly. Once the meat is nicely browned, add your onions and carrots. Let those cook for a bit, then add your mushrooms and garlic. Once everything is browned, transfer it all to a large pot. Then add a cup or two of chicken or beef stock to the hot pan to pick up all the flavor adhering to the bottom. Scrape up all the browned bits, then add that stock to your stew pot, along with another 6 to 7 cups of stock, and optionally a cup of dry red wine. Add the parsley, a bay leaf, some dried marjoram or thyme, a good amount of black pepper, and just a little bit of salt. You can always add more salt later if it's needed. Cover and simmer for about an hour and a half. After your stew is done cooking, we're going to thicken it with a roux. Estimate the amount of liquid in the pot, and for every cup of liquid, you're going to need 1 tablespoon of butter and 1 tablespoon of flour. Melt the butter in a pot that will be large enough to hold the stew liquid. Then whisk in the flour. Once the raw flour smell is gone, add your stew liquid and whisk vigorously as it comes to a boil. Once it's thickened to your liking, pour it back into your stew and gently mix. You can serve this stew with potatoes, noodles, or a good crusty bread. I'm going with some fettuccine. Once you've taken the time to make a delicious stew like this, take some time to savor it with family or friends, and thank God for the gift of divine love made food. In the next video, we'll prepare the rest of the leg of lamb and cook the second dish of lamb for 8 persons 4 times. If you're interested in reading the Supper of the Lamb to follow along with these recipes, I'll leave a link in the description. If you found this video helpful and you'd like to see more, please consider subscribing and sharing with your friends.